Most of history's greatest tragedies didn't begin with villains, explosions, or dramatic decisions. It started with something too small to be alarming, an overlooked detail, a justified delay, a calculation that was almost right. The silent signs were there from the beginning, but they seemed harmless. There were warning signs, that slight discomfort, that feeling that something didn't quite fit. But since nothing went wrong at the time, we moved forward. And we learned not to ignore the result, ignoring the warning. The problem is that the world doesn't give you two warnings in the same way. Early warning signs appear as doubts, noises, minor glitches that seem tolerable. These initial symptoms don't cause panic, so they are treated as exceptions, not the norm. Meanwhile, hidden symptoms accumulate in the background, waiting for the right moment to surface. The curious thing is that the body's signals, tension, urgency, that feeling of we should check again, almost always perceive them before reason. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Disasters are rarely unpredictable. They are disregarded. Someone felt it, someone noticed, someone thought about asking, reviewing, or delaying, but moved on. The signals your body is giving you were never the problem. The problem was learning to silence them. Today, you will see how small mistakes treated as details have turned into gigantic consequences. And more importantly, you will understand which symptoms you shouldn't ignore before the cost ceases to be historical and becomes personal. The missing permit. He often says that major disasters rarely begin with grandiose decisions. They almost always stem from overlooked details. In the case of missing permit, the silent signs were there from the beginning. Delayed paperwork, provisional permits, overconfidence. The warning signs appeared in small conversations, uncomfortable glances, that feeling that something wasn't quite right. But the early warning signs were dismissed as tedious bureaucracy, nothing urgent. The initial symptoms seemed harmless because nothing had gone wrong yet. And so they decided not to ignore the deadline, ignoring the risk. The organization's collective body already felt the weight, even without knowing how to explain it. He explains that permissions exist to create conscious pauses. When someone skips this step, silent signs of misguided haste emerge. The body's signals manifest as constant tension, rework, and fear of audits. A practical example is when someone starts a project just to get ahead without formal validation. These are hidden symptoms of a system that confuses agility with carelessness. Don't ignore it when progress seems too fast to be solid. Unchecked speed exacts a high price. He often jokes that the mistake wasn't the lack of toilet paper, but the lack of attention to the inconvenience. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include the normalization of recurring improvisation. When this works once, the warning signs become easier to silence. Even so, the silent signs continue to accumulate behind the scenes. Don't ignore it when immediate relief replaces long-term security. Those who learn to listen to these early symptoms avoid catastrophes before they even get a name. And this logic becomes even clearer when a simple delay changes the course of an entire war. The delayed scout plane at Midway. He often recalls that at the Battle of Midway, everything seemed under control until a small delay changed the fate of thousands. The reconnaissance plane took off too late, even with subtle signs that time was running out. There were warning signs in the clock, in the weather, in the enemy's movements. But the early warning signs were dismissed as operational overreaction. The initial symptoms were subtle, minutes slipping away, incomplete information, decisions made in the dark. They decided not to ignore the standard routine and ignored the real urgency. The strategic core of the operation was already out of sync. He explains that delayed information is almost as dangerous as incorrect information. When the data arrives after the right time, silent signs of false security emerge. The body language of a team manifests as anxiety, defensive decisions, and delayed reactions. A practical example is waiting for one more piece of information before acting, while the situation has already changed. These are hidden symptoms of excessive dependence on confirmation. Don't ignore it when time becomes the scarcest factor in the equation. Acting too late is also a choice. He often says that Midway wasn't lost due to a lack of courage, but because of minutes that were misinterpreted. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include recurring, always justified delays. When this works a few times, the warning signs lose their effectiveness. Even so, the silent signs continue to mark the invisible cost of hesitation. Don't ignore it when waiting seems more comfortable than deciding. Those who learn to read these early signs understand that timing is power. And this lesson is repeated when ambition creates something too big to be controlled. The ship that was too grand. He often says that some projects fail not because of weakness, but because of overconfidence. The ship was too big, too complex, and surrounded by silent signs that something was out of scale. There were warning signs in the rising costs, the rushed testing, the makeshift adaptations. These early warning signs were treated as the natural price of greatness. The initial symptoms resembled collective pride. It's great because it needs to be. They decided not to ignore ambition, ignoring physical and human limitations. The body of the structure was already creaking before it even touched the water. He explains that complexity requires operational humility. When it's lacking, silent signs of overload emerge. Systems that don't communicate, teams that don't understand each other. The body's signals appear as constant delays and emergency corrections. A practical example is when someone adds features without reviewing the existing code base. These are hidden symptoms of unsustainable growth. Don't ignore it when more starts to mean less control. Scale without simplicity comes at a price. He often jokes that the ship didn't sink because of bad luck, but because of elegant stubbornness. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include the phrase, "We've already invested too much to go back." When this takes hold, the warning signs are seen as a threat to the ego. Even so, the silent signals continue to vibrate within the structures. Don't ignore it when the noise starts before the impact. Those who learn to listen to these early symptoms prevent their pride from becoming a shipwreck. And this logic reappears when a machine starts complaining, literally. The groaning tank. He often says that when a machine starts complaining, it's doing exactly what humans avoid doing. Warning. The tank was emitting strange noises, unusual vibrations, and clear, silent signs of internal wear. There were warning signs in the reports, in the rushed inspections, in the suspicious glances of the technical team. These early warning signs were dismissed as normal operating noise. The initial symptoms seemed tolerable as the vehicle was still functioning. They decided not to ignore the mission, ignoring the mechanical warning. The metal structure was already at its limit, even before the collapse. He explains that systems fail gradually before failing completely. When strange sounds become normalized, silent signs of accumulated neglect emerge. The body's signs of an operation appear as constant tension and reactive maintenance. A practical example is postponing a review because there's still a little more time to go. These are hidden symptoms of overconfidence in the system's resilience. Don't ignore it when effort starts replacing efficiency. Forcing is not the same as moving forward. He often says that the tank didn't suddenly break down. It was ignored for too long. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include repeated noises, deviations, and small improvisations. When this works for a while, the warning signs lose credibility. Even so, the silent signs continue to accumulate piece by piece. Don't ignore it when something calls for a pause and you respond with pressure. Those who learn to recognize these early symptoms preserve resources before they become losses. And this logic repeats itself when a simple word, misinterpreted, changes everything. The misheard radio call. He often says that few things are as dangerous as hearing something wrong and acting with complete confidence. The radio call was misinterpreted, even with faint signs of interference and noise on the channel. There were warning signs in the truncated tone, the confusing repetitions, the misplaced pauses. These early warning signs were treated as a momentary communication failure. The initial symptoms seemed minor, a slightly different order, a course correction. They decided not to ignore the message they received, ignoring the doubt about what was said. The body of the operation confidently headed in the wrong direction. He explains that faulty communication doesn't warn you by shouting, it distorts your message. When words arrive incomplete, silent signs of hasty interpretation emerge. The body's signals appear as sudden tension, decisions made too quickly, and a lack of self-checking. A practical example is assuming you understood without confirming so as not to appear insecure. These are hidden symptoms of the ego operating above clarity. Don't ignore it when haste silences the right question. Confirming is also acting. He often says that many disasters begin with, "That's what I heard." Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include vague instructions and silence from the other end. When this works a few times, the warning signs are systematically ignored. Even so, the silent signs continue to appear in accumulated errors. Don't ignore it when clarity is sacrificed for speed. Those who learn to recognize these early symptoms know when to stop and repeat the process. And this attention becomes vital when the order itself is ambiguous, the ambiguous order. He often says that vague orders are elegant traps because they seem complete until they are executed. In this case, the instruction carried silent signs of ambiguity from the first reading. There were warning signs in the overly open-ended words, the verbs without context, and the margins of interpretation. These early warning signs were treated as strategic flexibility. The initial symptoms resembled autonomy, each team understanding things in their own way. They decided not to ignore the hierarchy, ignoring the need for precision. The operation's core fragmented without anyone realizing it. He explains that clarity doesn't limit, it protects. When orders allow for multiple readings, silent signs of progressive misalignment emerge. The body's signals appear as reworking internal conflicts and contradictory decisions. A practical example is sending long messages without setting a clear priority. These are hidden symptoms of communication that sounds intelligent but fails at the basics. Don't ignore it when freedom turns into chaos. Clear direction saves energy. He often says that no one disobeyed, everyone obeyed different versions. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include repeated questions and defensive interpretations. When this works for a while, the warning signs lose their urgency. Even so, the silent signs continue to create cracks in the system. Don't ignore it when understanding depends on assumption. Those who learn to read these initial symptoms learn to write better instructions. And this lesson becomes even harder when no one was listening, because the radio was off. The radio was off. He often says that sometimes the biggest mistake isn't the wrong message, it's having no message at all. The radio was off, even with silent signs that communication was essential at that moment. There were warning signs in the incomplete checklists, the tests not performed, and the overconfidence that everything was all right now. These early warning signs were ignored because nothing seemed urgent at the time. The initial symptoms were invisible, absolute silence, lack of feedback, false tranquility. They decided not to ignore the original plan, ignoring the critical dependence on communication. The main body of the operation advanced in isolation, unaware of it. He explains that operational silence is not peace. It is temporary blindness. When channels are closed, silent signs emerge of decisions made in a vacuum. The body's signals appear as diffuse insecurity, conservative movements, and a delayed reaction to events. A practical example is starting a complex task without confirming that everyone is connected. These are hidden symptoms of misplaced trust in inactive systems. Don't ignore it when the absence of information seems too comfortable. Comfort without return is risk. He often says that nobody noticed the mistake because nothing broke immediately. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include prolonged silence, where there should be communication. When this works once, the warning signs lose priority in the protocols. Even so, the silent signs continue to mark every decision made blindly. Don't ignore it when the system stops responding and you continue anyway. Those who learn to read these initial symptoms learn to test channels before moving forward. And this attention to detail becomes vital when a single wrong number costs billions. The billion-dollar math error. He often says that numbers rarely shout. They whisper, and that's where the danger lies. The calculation error seemed too small to matter, even with subtle signs scattered throughout the spreadsheets. There were warning signs in swapped units, harmless rounding, and unverified assumptions. These early warning signs were treated as a technical detail, something easy to fix later. The initial symptoms did not appear in the immediate results, only in the discomfort of the person reviewing them. They decided not to ignore the schedule. They chose to ignore careful review. The project's funding was already committed. He explains that incorrect math doesn't explode immediately. It accumulates. When a zero is out of place, subtle signs of distortion appear in subsequent decisions. The signs from a team's physique appear as constant justifications and excessive reliance on official numbers. A practical example is accepting reports without recalculating basic figures. These are hidden symptoms of poorly distributed authority. Don't ignore it when no one can explain the number simply. Clarity is a true test. He often says that the loss didn't come from the calculation, but from the culture surrounding it. Symptoms you shouldn't ignore include phrases like, "It's already been approved," or "Someone's already checked it." When this works a few times, the warning signs disappear from the routine. Even so, the silent signs continue to infiltrate every decision based on the initial mistake. Don't ignore it when trust replaces verification. Those who learn to read these early symptoms protect resources before they become historical statistics. And after so many examples, it becomes impossible to pretend that major disasters start out big. In the end, it all converges on a simple yet hard-to-swallow truth. Disasters don't happen suddenly. They are carried out in silence. Every story you've seen began with silent signs that asked for attention, not heroism. There were warning signs, there were early warning signs, there were those bodily signals that appear as discomfort, doubt, or a desire to check one more time. But when nothing exploded in the moment, we learned not to ignore the schedule, the ego, or the routine, and to ignore the warning. The real danger lies in normalization. When initial symptoms become minor, the hidden symptoms gain time to grow. Delays become habit, ambiguities become flexibility, silences become confidence, and without realizing it, we begin to call what is merely haste efficiency. Then, the signals your body is sending you are still there. Tension, false urgency, relief when someone decides for you. But they are muffled by the idea that it always worked out. So here's the direct and practical invitation. Where are you overlooking a detail today simply because it hasn't yet resulted in a bill? What symptoms should you be treating as noise that you shouldn't ignore? Learning from history isn't about becoming pessimistic. It's about gaining a safety margin. If this video made you pause before continuing on autopilot, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Future content will continue to show how small decisions shape big consequences, and how to read the right signs before the cost ceases to be theoretical and becomes real.